settle in. We're going to talk about a man who knew the precise moment to burn his entire world down. Imagine this: one man, born and raised a slave on a simple sugar plantation, standing against the absolute fury of the three greatest navies on earth. He had no gold, no ships, and no army that Napoleon would even call an army. But he had an idea, and history will show that Napoleon feared that idea more than any cannon. The question we ask tonight is not if he could win, but how long the vengeance of empires took to find him. In the sweltering heat of the northern plain of Saint-Domingue, where sugarcane grew taller than a man and harvested blood as readily as syrup, a boy was born into a condition not of choice, but of commerce. His name was Toussaint, though the surname Louverture would come later, bestowed not by birth, but by the arc of history itself. He entered the world sometime around 1743 on the Breda plantation, a modest estate near Cap Français that belonged to the Comte de Noailles and was managed by a humane but pragmatic overseer named Bayon de Libertad. Unlike most of the 500,000 enslaved Africans on the island, Toussaint was not born in the hull of a slave ship. His parents, Gao Guignou and his wife, had survived the Middle Passage and carved a fragile existence within the plantation's rigid hierarchy. They were of the Arada people from the Dahomey region, and they carried with them fragments of language, ritual, and memory that whispered of a world before chains. Toussaint's early life unfolded within the brutal arithmetic of plantation time, dawn to dusk labor, measured in stalks cut and cane crushed. Yet he was assigned to the stables, not the fields, a distinction that conferred marginally less physical punishment and marginally more autonomy. There, he learned to read and write, an act of quiet rebellion in a colony where literacy among the enslaved was forbidden. He studied the works of Epictetus, the Roman Stoic philosopher, whose teachings on endurance and self-mastery would later echo in his proclamations. He absorbed the cadences of the Catholic liturgy, not as blind dogma, but as a framework for moral order. He listened, he watched, he remembered. His mind, sharpened by deprivation, became a ledger of injustices, a map of weaknesses in the colonial machine. By his 30s, Toussaint had gained a reputation for intelligence, discretion, and physical resilience. He was granted his freedom around 1776, not as reward for loyalty, but as a pragmatic concession by Bayon de Libertad, who recognized in him a useful intermediary. Manumission did not mean equality. As a freedman of color, Toussaint remained legally subordinate to white colonists, barred from holding certain offices, and subject to the caprices of racial hierarchy. Yet he now owned a small plot of land, managed a modest coffee plantation, and even held a few slaves of his own, a fact that complicates his legacy but reflects the brutal logic of survival in a slave society. He married Suzanne Simone Baptiste, raised children, and lived a life of cautious pragmatism. He was not yet a revolutionary. He was a man learning the grammar of power in a world that denied him syntax. Then, in 1789, a tremor crossed the Atlantic. From Paris came news of a revolution, not of slaves, but of citizens. The Estates General, the Declaration of the Rights of Man, the storming of the Bastille. These phrases, carried on merchant ships and debated in port taverns, seeped into Saint-Domingue like rain into cracked earth. For white colonists, the revolution meant greater autonomy from Paris. For free people of color, many of them wealthy, educated, and mixed race. It meant equal rights under the new French Constitution. For the enslaved, it meant something more dangerous: possibility. The idea that liberty was not a European luxury, but a universal condition, began to circulate in hushed tones, in vodou ceremonies held in hidden clearings, in the coded songs of field workers. Toussaint, fluent in French, Creole, and the language of power, understood the implications better than most. He did not rush to arms. He waited. He watched the fissures widen. He knew that empires do not crumble from without until they rot from within. The plantation system of saint-domingue was the most profitable enterprise in the 18th century world. Sugar, coffee, indigo, and cotton flowed from its ports to feed European appetites and fill metropolitan treasuries. But this wealth was built on a foundation of unimaginable cruelty. Enslaved Africans were worked to death in 7 years on average. Whippings, mutilations, and executions were routine. The colony imported 40,000 new captives annually just to maintain its labor force. It was a society balanced on the edge of a knife, held in place only by terror. And terror, as history shows, has a shelf life. When the French National Assembly hesitated to extend rights to free people of color in 1790, a rebellion erupted in the south, led by Vincent Auger. Auger was captured, broken on the wheel, and his head displayed in a cage. The message was clear: the old order was no longer unassailable. Toussaint observed this. He saw how quickly ideals could curdle into violence. He understood that the next eruption would not be contained. He began to prepare, not with weapons, but with knowledge, with alliances, with silence. By 1791, the colony was a tinderbox. Drought, inflation, and political uncertainty had frayed nerves. On the night of August 21st, under a blood moon, the northern plain exploded. Hundreds of plantations were torched. Overseers were killed. The rebellion was not spontaneous chaos. It was coordinated, planned in secret councils, timed to coincide with the vodou ceremony at Bois-Caïman. Within weeks, the rebellion had engulfed the north. 20,000 enslaved people were in open revolt. The colonial militia, outnumbered and demoralized, could not contain it. Toussaint, still a freedman with property to lose, did not join immediately. He sent his family into hiding. He secured his livestock. And then, quietly, he disappeared into the hills. When he reappeared, it was not as a planter, but as a commander. The ember had become flame. The cane field had birthed its own fire. In the chaos of late 1791, Toussaint Louverture emerged not as a messiah, but as a strategist. He did not proclaim himself leader of the rebellion. He earned command through competence. His first role was not on the front lines, but in the rear, organizing supply lines, treating the wounded with his knowledge of medicinal herbs, and coordinating communications between scattered bands. He quickly distinguished himself by his discipline. While other rebel leaders sanctioned indiscriminate violence, Toussaint forbade the killing of doctors, women, or non-combatants. He preserved sugar mills and infrastructure, understanding that destruction without purpose served only vengeance, not liberation. His forces grew not through charisma alone, but through a reputation for order. Men flocked to him, not because he promised paradise, but because he offered a chance to survive with honor. At this stage, the rebellion was not monolithic. Spain, which controlled the eastern two-thirds of Hispaniola, saw an opportunity to weaken French control. From its base in Santo Domingo, the Spanish crown offered arms, supplies, and commissions to rebel leaders who would fight under its banner. In 1793, Toussaint accepted a Spanish officer's commission and adopted the title Brigadier General. He justified this alliance as tactical necessity. France, after all, had not yet abolished slavery. Why should the enslaved fight for a republic that still held them in chains? His forces, now numbering in the thousands, pushed deep into the French colony, capturing key towns and forcing white planters to flee. Yet even as he wore a Spanish uniform, Toussaint maintained his independence. He refused to convert to Catholicism as Spain demanded. He continued to negotiate with French Republican agents. He was playing a longer game. Then, in February 1794, the French National Convention did the unthinkable. It abolished slavery throughout all French territories. The decree was motivated less by morality than by military desperation. British and Spanish forces were seizing French colonies, and emancipation was seen as a way to rally the enslaved to the Republic's defense. But for Toussaint, it was a moment of profound ideological alignment. He severed ties with Spain immediately. Declaring his loyalty to the French Republic, he turned his army against his former allies. The switch was not without risk. Many of his followers distrusted Paris. But Toussaint argued that the Republic, however flawed, had taken the necessary step. The institution of slavery was now the enemy, not the nation. His forces swept eastward, driving the Spanish back across the border. By 1795, the entire island was under his control. He had expelled foreign occupiers using their own weapons against them. Next came the British. Alarmed by the chaos in Saint-Domingue and eager to seize its wealth, Britain dispatched a massive expeditionary force in 1793. At its peak, the British occupation involved over 20,000 troops. They captured key ports, including Port-au-Prince and Léogâne, but they underestimated the terrain, the climate, and the resolve of the rebels. Yellow fever decimated their ranks. Toussaint, now commanding a disciplined army of former slaves, waged a relentless campaign of attrition. He avoided large-scale battles, instead using guerrilla tactics, ambushes, scorched earth, and psychological warfare. He offered clemency to deserters, turning British soldiers into intelligence assets. By 1798, after 5 years of fighting and 15,000 British dead, the United Kingdom withdrew. Saint-Domingue was free of foreign armies for the first time in centuries. Toussaint, the former stable hand, was now the undisputed military master of the island. His leadership was not merely martial. He understood that victory without governance was hollow. He reinstated agricultural production, not through slavery, but through a system of paid labor tied to the land. He enforced strict curfews and harsh penalties for looting, arguing that anarchy would invite reconquest. He opened schools, promoted trade with the United States, and negotiated treaties with foreign powers. He even invited white planters to return, promising them protection and property rights, as long as they accepted the new social order. This pragmatism alienated some of his more radical allies, who saw any accommodation with former masters as betrayal. But Toussaint was clear: independence required stability, and stability required economy. He was not building a utopia. He was building a state. By 1799, Saint-Domingue was functioning as a de facto independent nation. Paris, embroiled in its own political upheavals, offered little oversight. Toussaint ruled from Cap Français, issuing decrees, appointing officials, and commanding an army of 55,000 men. He wore the uniform of a French general, but his allegiance was to the people he had liberated. The world watched in disbelief. A former slave, commanding a black army, governing a colony once considered the jewel of European empire. In London, newspapers called him the Black Spartacus. In Paris, whispers grew louder. Could such a man be trusted? The fire had spread. But empires do not surrender their jewels without a reckoning. With foreign armies expelled and internal order restored, Toussaint Louverture turned his attention to the architecture of sovereignty. His challenge was unprecedented: how to build a functioning society on the ruins of slavery. He rejected both the chaos of unregulated freedom and the return to plantation tyranny. Instead, he imposed a strict labor code, requiring all citizens to work on state-supervised plantations, with wages paid and quotas enforced. It was not slavery, for workers could not be bought or sold, but it was not liberty as the Enlightenment envisioned. Toussaint defended it as necessary. Without sugar exports, the colony would starve and invite invasion. He argued that true freedom required economic resilience. His critics called it slavery by another name. His supporters called it realism. The truth lay somewhere in between. In 1801, Toussaint took his boldest step. He convened a constitutional assembly and promulgated a document that would define Saint-Domingue's future. The Constitution of 1801 abolished slavery forever. It declared all inhabitants, regardless of color, equal before the law. It established freedom of religion and trade, and it named Toussaint Louverture Governor General for life, with the power to appoint his successor. This was not a declaration of independence. Technically, Saint-Domingue remained a French colony, but it was a declaration of autonomy. The Constitution was sent to Paris, not for approval, but for acknowledgement. Toussaint had effectively rewritten the social contract. He was no longer a rebel. He was a head of state. His diplomacy was as precise as his military campaigns. He opened trade with the United States, bypassing French mercantile restrictions. He signed a commercial treaty with Britain, despite their recent war. He maintained cordial relations with the Spanish in Santo Domingo. He knew that recognition, even informal, was a shield against reconquest. Yet he remained careful not to provoke Paris directly. He continued to fly the French tricolour. He invoked the ideals of the Republic, but his actions spoke louder than symbols. He governed as if Saint-Domingue belonged to its people, not to a distant metropole. This delicate balance could not last. In France, a new power was rising, one who saw compromise as weakness and autonomy as defiance. Napoleon Bonaparte, crowned first consul in 1799, had grand visions of restoring France's colonial empire. Saint-Domingue was central to this plan. Its sugar wealth would fund his European wars. Its submission would demonstrate France's renewed strength. Napoleon did not see Toussaint as a statesman. He saw him as an upstart, a dangerous precedent. Rumors reached Paris that Toussaint was plotting independence, that he was arming a black empire that would inspire revolts in Jamaica, Cuba, and Louisiana. These rumors were exaggerated, but they served Napoleon's purpose. He began planning an expedition, not to negotiate, to subdue. Toussaint, sensing the storm, strengthened his defenses. He built fortifications. He stockpiled weapons. He sent envoys to Washington and London. He knew that the next invasion would not come with offers of alliance. It would come with chains. Internally, cracks began to show. Some of his lieutenants, André Rigaud, Alexandre Pétion, Jean-Jacques Dessalines, chafed under his authoritarian style. Rigaud, a free man of color from the south, had once fought Toussaint in a bloody civil war known as the War of Knives. Though defeated, he remained influential. Pétion and others resented Toussaint's centralization of power and his retention of white planters. They dreamed of a republic more democratic, more radical. Toussaint, for his part, saw dissent as a luxury the colony could not afford. Unity was survival. He suppressed opposition with arrests and exile. His rule became more rigid. The very discipline that had secured liberation now threatened to isolate him. He stood alone at the center of his creation, the architect of the impossible republic, unaware that the empire he had outmaneuvered was preparing its final, most desperate move. In December 1801, a fleet of 86 ships slipped out of Brest Harbor under cover of winter fog. On board were over 30,000 soldiers, the largest expeditionary force France had ever assembled. At its head was General Charles Leclerc, Napoleon's brother-in-law, a man chosen for his loyalty, not his experience in tropical warfare. Their orders were explicit: restore French authority, disarm the black population, and reinstate the colonial order. Slavery was not to be mentioned openly. Napoleon knew that declaration would unite the colony against him, but it was the unspoken goal. The expedition carried coded instructions to arrest Toussaint and deport him to France. The emperor believed that removing the head would cause the body to collapse. He did not understand that the body had already grown a soul. Toussaint had expected the invasion, but its scale shocked even him. Leclerc's forces landed in multiple ports simultaneously in February 1802. They captured Cap Français, Port-au-Prince, and Les Cayes with alarming speed. Many white planters welcomed them as liberators. Some free people of color, disillusioned with Toussaint, joined their ranks, but the majority of the black population did not. Toussaint ordered a strategic retreat. He burned crops, poisoned wells, and evacuated civilians into the mountains. His plan was not to hold cities, but to bleed the French dry. He knew that yellow fever, the silent ally of Saint-Domingue, would soon claim more lives than any battle. His generals, Dessalines, Christophe, Maurepas, waged a brutal guerrilla war. Villages became fortresses. Forests became ambush zones. The French, trained for European battlefields, floundered in the heat and mud. For months, the war seesawed. Leclerc, frustrated by the resistance, resorted to terror. He executed prisoners, burned villages, and reinstated the slave trade in captured territories. But these actions only hardened opposition. Toussaint, meanwhile, remained elusive. He moved between hidden camps, issuing orders, rallying morale. He even attempted a counter-offensive, nearly recapturing Cap Français. But betrayal began to erode his command. Leclerc, cunning, exploited divisions among his lieutenants. He offered pardons, promotions, and promises of autonomy. Dessalines, ever pragmatic, began secret negotiations. Christophe wavered. Toussaint, sensing isolation, sought terms. Leclerc, feigning goodwill, offered peace if Toussaint would retire to his plantation. He guaranteed his safety. Toussaint, exhausted and perhaps hoping to spare his people further bloodshed, agreed. On June 7, 1802, Toussaint Louverture rode into Cap Français under a white flag. He was met with honors, but within hours he was arrested, shackled in irons. His family was seized. He was dragged onto the ship Le Héros and sailed for France. Leclerc wrote to Napoleon, "The colony is ours. The blacks will now submit." But submission was an illusion. News of Toussaint's betrayal ignited a new wave of resistance. Dessalines, realizing Napoleon's true intent, switched sides again. The war resumed with greater ferocity, and yellow fever, as predicted, began its grim harvest. By November, Leclerc himself was dead, buried in a lead-lined coffin to prevent contagion. Over 20,000 French soldiers had perished. The expedition was collapsing, but Toussaint would not live to see it. He arrived in France in July 1802. He was transported in chains across the country to the Fort de Joux, a medieval fortress buried in the snows of the Jura Mountains. His cell was unheated, damp, and windowless. He was denied books, visitors, and adequate food. Interrogators questioned him daily, seeking confessions of treason. He responded with stoic silence or cryptic replies. "I am a Frenchman," he once said. "I have done only what a Frenchman should do." His health deteriorated. Frostbite, malnutrition, and pneumonia took hold. On April 7, 1803, Toussaint Louverture died alone in his cell. His body was buried in a mass grave. Napoleon ordered his name erased from official records, but empires cannot unmake ghosts. The fire Toussaint lit could not be extinguished by snow. Toussaint's death did not end the revolution. It consecrated it. In Saint-Domingue, the news of his betrayal and death transformed him from a leader into a symbol. Jean-Jacques Dessalines, once his most brutal lieutenant, now became the standard-bearer of total liberation. He united former rivals, Christophe, Pétion, and others, under a single banner. The cry was no longer liberty under France, but death to the French. The final campaign was merciless. Dessalines ordered the massacre of remaining white colonists, not out of indiscriminate hatred, but as a grim calculation. A nation born of slavery could not coexist with its former masters. By late 1803, the last French troops, decimated by disease and desertion, surrendered. On January 1st, 1804, in the city of Gonaïves, Dessalines declared the independence of Haiti, the first black republic in the world, the only nation born of a successful slave revolt. The world reacted with horror and fascination. The United States, a slave-holding republic, refused to recognize Haiti for 60 years. France demanded reparations for lost property, a debt Haiti paid until 1947, crippling its economy for generations. Britain, while ending its slave trade in 1807, imposed a naval blockade to contain the infection of black sovereignty. Yet Haiti endured. Its existence became a beacon for abolitionists and a nightmare for slaveholders. In the American South, new laws forbade the teaching of reading to the enslaved. In Cuba, planters whispered of another Saint-Domingue. The Haitian Revolution had redrawn the moral geography of the Atlantic world. Toussaint Louverture never saw Haiti. He died in a French dungeon, believing his life's work had failed. But history judges not by endings, but by echoes. His constitution became the blueprint for Haitian law. His military discipline became the model for national defense. His insistence on abolition became the unshakable core of Haitian identity. Even his authoritarianism served a purpose. It proved that black people could govern, could build institutions, could wield power without European tutelage. The myth of black incapacity, so central to the justification of slavery, was shattered forever. Today, his legacy is complex. He owned slaves. He suppressed dissent. He compromised with former oppressors. But he also chose liberation over comfort, principle over power, and dignity over survival. He understood that freedom is not a moment, but a structure, and he built that structure with his hands, his mind, and his silence. In the end, Napoleon did not defeat Toussaint Louverture. The cold of Fort de Joux did not erase him. Time did not bury him. He walks still in the streets of Port-au-Prince, in the constitutions of liberated nations, in every law that says a human being is not property. He is the ghost who built a nation, and nations, once built, cannot be unmade. The fire in the cane field burned long after the cane was gone, and somewhere in the quiet between the stars, a man who knew the precise moment to burn his world down watches and waits.